Section 12 of A Dish of Orts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Bryan Stewart. A Dish of Orts by George MacDonald. Section 12. The History and Heroes of Medicine. Footnote by J. Rutherford Russell, M.D. In this volume, Dr. Russell was not merely aimed at the production of a book that might be serviceable to the faculty, by which the history of its own art is not at all sufficiently studied, but has aspired to the far more difficult success of writing a history of medicine which shall be readable to all who care for true history. That history, namely, in which not merely growth and change are represented, but the secret supplies and influences as well, which minister to the one and occasion the other. If the difficulty has been greater, although with his evidently wide sympathies and keen insight into humanity we doubt if it has, the success is the more honourable, for a success it certainly is. The partially biographical plan on which he has constructed his work has no doubt aided in the accomplishment of this purpose, for it is much easier to present the subject in its human relations, when its history is given in connection with the lives of those who were most immediately associated with it. But it would be a great mistake to conclude from this that it is the less a history of the art itself. For no art or science has life in itself, apart from the minds which foresee, discover, and verify it. Whatever point in its progress it may have reached, it will there remain until a new man appears, whose new questions shall elicit new replies from nature, replies which are the essential food of the science by which it lives, grows, and makes itself a history. Nor must our readers suppose that because the book is readable, it is therefore slight, either in material or construction. Much reading and research has provided the material, while real thought and argument have superintended the construction. Nor is it by any means without the adornment that a poetic temperament and a keen sense of humour can supply. Naturally, the central life in the book is that of Lord Bacon, the man who brought out of his treasures things both new and old. Up to him, the story gradually leads from the prehistoric times of Aesculapius, the pathway first becoming plainly visible in the life and labours of Hippocrates. His fine intellect and powers of acute observation afforded the material necessary for the making of a true physician. The Greek mind, partly, perhaps, from its artistic tendencies, seems to have been peculiarly impatient of incomplete forms, and therefore to have much preferred the construction of a theory from the most shadowy material, to the patient experimentation and investigation necessary for the procuring of the real substance. And Hippocrates, not knowing how to advance to a theory by rational experimentation, and too honest to invent one, assumes the traditional theories, founded on the vaguest and most obtrusive generalizations. Those which his experience taught him to reject were adopted and maintained by Galen, and all who followed him for centuries, the chief instance of progress being only the substitution by the Arabians of some of the milder medicines now in use, for the terrible and often fatal drugs employed by the Greek and Roman physicians. The fanciful classification of diseases into four kinds, hot, cold, moist, and dry, with the corresponding arbitrary classifications of remedies to be administered by contraries, continued to be the only recognized theory of medicine for many centuries after the Christian era. But Lord Bacon, among other branches of knowledge which he considered ill followed, makes a special mention of medicine, which he would submit to the same rules of observation and experimentation laid down by him for the advancement of learning in general. With regard to it, as with regard to the discovery of all the higher laws of nature, he considers that men have made too untimely a departure and too remote a recess from particles. Men have hurried to conclusions, and then argued from them as from facts. Therefore let us have no traditional theories, and make none for ourselves but such as are revealed in the form of laws to the patient investigator, who has, straightened and held fast Proteus, that he might be compelled to change his shapes, and so reveal his nature. Hence, one of the aspects in which Lord Bacon was compelled to appear was that of a destroyer of what preceded. In this he resembled Cardan and Paracelsus, who went before him, and who like him pulled down, but could not like him build up. He resembled them, however, in the possession of another element of character, namely, that poetic imagination which looks abroad into the regions of possibilities, and foresees or invents. But in the case of the charlatan, the vaguest suggestions of his mind, in its favourite mood, is adopted as a theory all but proved, if not as a direct revelation to the favoured individual, while the true thinker seeks but an hypothesis corresponding in some measure to facts already discovered, in order that he may have the suggestion of new experiments and investigations in the course of his attempts to verify or disprove the hypothesis. Lord Bacon considered hypothesis invaluable in the discovery of truth, but he only used it as a board against which to write his questions to nature. Or, to use another figure, hypothesis with him is as the next stepping stone in the swollen river, which he supposes to be here or there, and so feels for with his staff. But it must be proved before it be regarded as a law, and greatly corroborated before it be even adopted as a theory. Cardan and Paracelsus were destroyers and mystics only. They destroyed on the earth, that they might build up in the air. Lord Bacon united both characters in the philosopher. He looked abroad into the regions of the unknown, whence all knowledge comes. He called wonder the seed of knowledge. He would build nowhere but on the earth, on the firm land of ascertained truth. That which kept him right was his practical humanity. It was for the sake of delivering men from the ills of life, by discovering the laws of the elements amidst which life must be led, that he laboured and thought. This object kept him true, made him able to discover the very laws of discovery, brought him so far into rapport with the heart of nature itself, that, like a physical prophet, his seeing could outspeed his knowing, and behold a law, dimly is true, but yet behold, long before his intellect, which had to build bridges and find straw to make bricks, could dare to affirm its approach to the same conclusion. Truth to humanity made him true to fact, and truth to fact made him true in theory. It was in this spirit of devotion to his kind that he said, "Therefore here is the deference which I find, that physicians have not set down and delivered over certain experimental medicines for the cure of particular diseases." Dr. Russell's true insights into the relation of Lord Bacon to the medical, as well as to all science, has suggested the above remarks. What our author chiefly desires is, that the same principles which made medicine what it is, should be allowed to carry it out further, and make it what it ought to be, and must become. As he goes on to show, through succeeding lives and theories, that just in proportion as these principles have been followed, the principles of careful observation, hypothesis, and experiment, have men made discoveries that have been helpful to their fellow men, while, on the other hand, the most elaborate theories of the most popular physicians, which have owed their birth to premature generalization and invention, have passed away, like the crackling of thorns under a pot. Belonging to the latter class of men, we have Stahl, Hoffmann, Boerhaave, Cullen, and Brown, while to the former belong Harvey, Sydenham, Jenner, and Hahnemann. After the last name, there is no need to say that our author is a homeopath. Whatever may be our private opinion of the system, justice requires that we shall say at least that books such as these are quite as open to refutation as to ridicule, for it is only a good argument that is worth refuting by a better. But we fear there are a few books on this subject that treat it with the calmness and fairness which would incline an honest homeopath to put them into the hands of one of the opposite party as an exposition of his opinions. There is no excitement in these pages. They are the work of a man of liberal education, of refinement, and truthfulness, with power to understand and facility to express, one of whose main object is to vindicate for homeopathy, on the most upright of all grounds, those on which alone science can stand, on the ground, that is, of laws discovered by observation and experiment, the place not only of a fact in the history of medicine, but the right to be considered as one of the greatest advancements toward the establishment of a science of curing. Certainly, if he and the rest of his advocates should fail utterly in this, the heresy will yet have established itself a memorial in history as one of the most powerful illusions that have ever deceived both priests and people. But the chief advantage which the system will derive from Dr. Russell's book will spring, it seems to us, from his attempt, a successful one it must be confessed, to prove that homeopathy is a development and not a mere reaction, that it has its roots far down in the history of science. The first mention of it in this book, however, is made for the purpose of disavowing the claim, advanced by many a homeopathist, to Hippocrates as one of their order. Not to mention the curious story about Galen and the patient ill from an overdose to thericum, who was cured by another dose of the same substance, nor the ridicule of the doctrine of contraries from Paracelsus and Van Helmont, nor the ridicule of the doctrine of contraries by Paracelsus and Van Helmont, nor the fact that the contraries of Boerhaave, by his own explanation, merely signify whatever substances prove their contrariety to the disease by curing it. To pass by these, we find one of the main objects to homeopathy, the discovery of specifics, insisted upon by Lord Bacon in his words already quoted. Not that homeopaths, while they depend upon specifics, believe that there is any such thing as a specific for a disease being as various as the individuality of the human beings whom it may attack, that an approximate specific may be found for every well-defined stage in every individual disease, a disease having its process of change, development, and decline, like a vegetable or animal life, besides an equally strong desire for specifics and a determined opposition to compound medicines. Boyle, who was born the year of Bacon's death, and inherited the mantle of the great philosopher, manifests a strong belief in the power of the infinitesimal dose. Neither Bacon nor Boyle, however, were medical men by profession, but some of them followed them, according to Dr. Russell, in their tendency towards specifics. It is almost needless to mention Jenner's victory over the smallpox, as, in the eyes of the homeopaths, a grand step in the development of their system. It gives Dr. Russell an opportunity to show in a strong instance that the best discoveries for delivering mankind from these ills, even of which they are most sensible, have been received with derision, with more than bare unbelief. This is one of his objects in the book, and while it is no proof whatever of the truth of homeopathy, it shows at least that the opposition manifested to it is no proof of its falsehood. This is enough, for it seeks to be tried on its own merits, and its foes are bound to accord it this when it is advocated in such an honest and dignified manner as in the book before us. The need of man, in physics as well as in higher things, is the guide to truth. With evils of any sort, we need no further acquaintance than may be gained in the endeavour to combat them. The discovery of what will cure diseases seems the only natural mode of rising by generalization to the discovery of the laws of cure and the nature of disease. Those portions of the volume which discuss the influence of Christianity on the healing art, likewise those relating to the different feelings with which at different times in different countries physicians have been regarded, are especially interesting. The only portion of the book we should be inclined to find fault with, as to the quality of the thought expended upon it, is a dissertation in the second chapter of the Sukha and Numa. We doubt likewise whether the author gives the Arceus of Van Helmont quite fair play, but these are questions so purely theoretical that they scarcely admit of discussion here. We rise from the perusal of the book, whatever may be our feelings with regard to the truth or falsehood of the system it advocates, with increased respect for the profession of medicine, with enlarged hope for its future, and with a strong feeling of the nobility conferred by the art upon every one of its practitioners who is aware of the dignity of his calling. End of section 12.
Section 13 of A Dish of Orts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dish of Orts by George MacDonald. Wordsworth's Poetry. The history of the poetry of Wordsworth is a true reflex of the man himself. The life of Wordsworth was not outwardly eventful, but his inner life was full of conflict, discovery, and progress. His outward life seems to have been so ordered by Providence as to favor the development of the poetic life within. Educated in the country, and spending most of his life in the society of nature, he was not subjected to those violent external changes which have been the lot of some poets. Perfectly fitted as he was to cope with the world and to fight his way to any desired position, he chose to retire from it, and in solitude to work out what appeared to him to be the true destiny of his life. The very element in which the mind of Wordsworth lived and moved was a Christian pantheism. Allow me to explain the word. The poets of the Old Testament speak of everything as being the work of God's hand. We are the, quote, work of his hand. The world was made by him, end quote. But in the New Testament, there is a higher form used to express the relation in which we stand to him. Quote, we are his offspring, end quote. Not the work of his hand, but the children that came forth from his heart. Our own poet Goldsmith, with the high instinct of genius, speaks of God as having, quote, loved us into being, end quote. Now, I think this is not only true with regard to man, but true likewise with regard to the world in which we live. This world is not merely a thing which God hath made, subjecting it to laws, but it is an expression of the thought, the feeling, the heart of God himself. And so it must be, because if man be the child of God, would he not feel to be out of his element if he lived in a world which came not from the heart of God, but only from his hand? This Christian pantheism, this belief that God is in everything and showing himself in everything, has been much brought to the light by the poets of the past generation, and has its influence still, I hope, upon the poets of the present. We are not satisfied that the world should be a proof and varying indication of the intellect of God. That was how Paley viewed it. He taught us to believe that there is a God from the mechanism of the world, but allowing all the argument to be quite correct, what does it prove? A mechanical God, and nothing more. Let us go further, and looking at beauty, believe that God is the first of artists, that he has put beauty into nature, knowing how it will affect us, and intending that it should so affect us, that he has embodied his own grand thoughts thus that we might see them and be glad. Then let us go further still, and believe that whatever we feel in the highest moments of truth shining through beauty, whatever comes to our souls as a power of life, is meant to be seen and felt by us, and to be regarded not as the work of his hand, but as the flowing forth of his heart, the flowing forth of his love of us, making us blessed in the union of his heart and ours. Now, Wordsworth is the high priest of nature thus regarded. He saw God present everywhere, not always immediately in his own form, it is true, but whether he looked upon the awful mountain peak, sky encompassed with loveliness, or upon the face of a little child, which is, as it were, eyes in the face of nature, in all things he felt the solemn presence of the divine spirit. By Keats, this presence was recognized only as the spirit of beauty. To Wordsworth, God, as the spirit of truth, was manifested through the forms of the external world. I have said that the life of Wordsworth was so ordered as to bring this out of him in the forms of his art to the ears of men. In childhood, even his conscience was partly developed through the influences of nature upon him. He thus retrospectively describes this special influence of nature. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cave, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. Not without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still, on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There, in her mooring place, I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colors of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. Here we see that a fresh impulse was given to his life, even in boyhood, by the influence of nature. If we have had any similar experience, we shall be able to enter into this feeling of Wordsworth's. If not, the tale will be almost incredible. One passage more I would refer to as showing what Wordsworth felt with regard to nature in his youth, and the growth that took place in him in consequence. Nature laid up in the storehouse of his mind and heart her most beautiful and grand forms, whence they might be brought afterwards to be put to the highest human service. I quote only a few lines from that poem, deservedly a favorite with all the lovers of Wordsworth, lines written above Tintern Abbey. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms, were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures, not for this faint I, nor mourn, nor murmur. Other gifts have followed. For such loss I would believe abundant recompense. For I have learned to look on nature not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh, nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. In this little passage, you see the growth of the influence of nature on the mind of the poet. You observe, too, that nature passes into poetry, that form is sublimed into speech. You see the result of the conjunction of the mind of man and the mind of God manifested in his works, spirit coming to know the speech of spirit. The outflowing of spirit in nature is received by the poet, and he utters again in his form what God has already uttered in his. Wordsworth wished to give to man what he found in nature. It was to him a power of good, a world of teaching, a strength of life. He knew that nature was not his, and that his enjoyment of nature was given to him that he might give it to man. It was the birthright of man. But what did Wordsworth find in nature? To begin with the lowest, he found amusement in nature. Right amusement is a part of teaching. It is the childish form of teaching, and if we can get this in nature, we get something that lies near the root of good. In proof that Wordsworth found this, I refer to a poem which you probably know well, The Daisy. The poet sits playing with a flower and listening to the suggestions that come to him of odd resemblances that this flower bears to other things. He likens the daisy to a little cyclops with one eye, staring to threaten and defy. That thought comes next, and instantly the freak is over. The shape will vanish, and behold, a silver shield with boss of gold that spreads itself, some fairy bold in fight to cover. Look at the last stanza, too, and you will see how close amusement may lie to deep and earnest thought. Bright flower, for by that name at last, when all my reveries are past, I call thee, and to that cleave fast, sweet silent creature, that breathed with me in sun and air, do thou, as thou art wont, repair my heart with gladness, and a share of thy meek nature. But Wordsworth found also joy in nature, which is a better thing than amusement, and consequently easier to be found. We can often have joy where we can have no amusement. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what health the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, They flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. This is the joy of the eye, as far as that can be separated from the joy of the whole nature. For his whole nature rejoiced in the joy of the eye, but it was simply joy. There was no further teaching, no attempt to go through this beauty and find the truth below it. We are not always to be in that hungry, restless condition, even after truth itself. If we keep our minds quiet and ready to receive truth, and sometimes are hungry for it, that is enough. Going a step higher, you will find that he sometimes draws a lesson from nature, seeming almost to force a meaning from her. I do not object to this if he does not make too much of it as existing in nature. It is rather finding a meaning in nature that he brought to it. The meaning exists, if not there. For illustration, I refer to another poem. Observe that Wordsworth found the lesson because he looked for it and would find it. This lawn, a carpet all alive with shadows flung from leaves, to strive in dance amid a press of sunshine, an apt emblem yields of worldlings reveling in the fields of strenuous idleness. Yet, spite of all this eager strife, this ceaseless play, the genuine life that serves the steadfast hours is in the grass beneath that grows unheeded, and the mute repose of sweetly breathing flowers. Whether he forced this lesson from nature or not, it is a good lesson, teaching a great many things with regard to life and work. Again, nature sometimes flashes a lesson on his mind, gives it to him, and when nature gives, we cannot but receive, as in this sonnet composed during a storm. One who was suffering tumult in his soul, yet failed to seek the sure relief of prayer, went forth, his course surrendering to the care of the fierce wind, while midday lightnings prowl insidiously, untimely thunders growl, while trees, dim seen, in frenzied numbers tear the lingering remnant of their yellow hair, and shivering wolves, surprised with darkness, howl as if the sun were not. He raised his eye, soul smitten, for that instant did appear large space, mid dreadful clouds of purest sky, an azure disk shield of tranquillity, invisible, unlooked for, minister of providential goodness ever nigh. Observe that he was not looking for this. He had not thought of praying. He was in such distress that it had benumbed the outgoings of his spirit towards the source whence alone sure comfort comes. He went out into the storm, and the uproar in the outer world was in harmony with the tumult within his soul. Suddenly, a clear space in the sky makes him feel, he has no time to think about it, that there is a shield of tranquillity spread over him. For was it not, as it were, an opening up into that region where there are no storms, the regions of peace, because the regions of love and truth and purity, the home of God himself? There is yet a higher and more sustained influence exercised by nature, and that takes effect when she puts a man into that mood or condition in which thoughts come of themselves. That is perhaps the best thing that can be done for us, the best at least that nature can do. It is certainly higher than mere intellectual teaching. That nature did this for Wordsworth is very clear, and it is easily intelligible. If the world proceeded from the imagination of God, and man proceeded from the love of God, it is easy to believe that that which proceeded from the imagination of God should rouse the best thoughts in the mind of a being who proceeded from the love of God. This, I think, is the relation between man and the world. As an instance of what I mean, I refer to one of Wordsworth's finest poems, which he classes under the head of quote-unquote evening voluntaries. It was composed upon an evening of extraordinary splendor and beauty. Had this effulgence disappeared with flying haste, I might have sent among the speechless clouds a look of blank astonishment. But 'tis endued with power to stay and sanctify one closing day, that frail mortality may see what is, no, but what can be. Time was when field and watery cove with modulated echoes rang, while choirs of fervent angels sang their vespers in the grove, or crowning star-like each some sovereign height warbled for heaven above and earth below strains suitable to both. Such holy rite, methinks, if audibly repeated now from hill or valley, could not move sublimer transport, purer love, than doth this silent spectacle, the gleam, the shadow, and the peace supreme. No sound is uttered, but a deep and solemn harmony pervades the hollow vale from steep to steep, and penetrates the glades. Wings at my shoulders seem to play, but rooted here I stand and gaze on those bright steps that heavenward raise their practicable way. Come forth, ye drooping old men, look abroad, and see to what fair countries ye are bound. Dread power, whom peace and calmness serve no less than nature's threatening voice, from thee, if I would swerve, oh, let thy grace remind me of the light full early lost and fruitlessly deplored, which at this moment on my waking sight appears to shine, by miracle restored. My soul, though yet confined to earth, rejoices in a second birth. Picture the scene for yourselves, and observe how it moves in him the sense of responsibility, and the prayer that if he has in any matter wandered from the right road, if he has forgotten the simplicity of childhood in the toil of life, he may from this time remember the vow that he now records, from this time to press on towards the things that are unseen, but which are manifested through the things that are seen. I refer you likewise to the poem Resolution and Independence, commonly called the Leech Gatherer, also to that grandest ode that has ever been written, the Ode on Immortality. You will find there, whatever you may think of his theory in the latter, sufficient proof that nature was to him a divine teaching power. Do not suppose that I mean that man can do without more teaching than nature's, or that a man with only nature's teaching would have seen these things in nature. No, the soul must be tuned to such things. Wordsworth could not have found such things had he not known something that was more definite and helpful to him. But this known, then nature was full of teaching. When we understand the Word of God, then we understand the works of God. When we know the nature of an artist, we know his pictures. When we have known and talked with a poet, we understand his poetry far better. To the man of God, all nature will be but changeful reflections of the face of God. Loving man as Wordsworth did, he was most anxious to give him this teaching. How was he to do it? By poetry. Nature put into the crucible of a loving heart becomes poetry. we cannot explain poetry scientifically, because poetry is something beyond science. The poet may be man of science, and the man of science may be a poet, but poetry includes science, and the man who will advance science most is the man who, other qualifications being equal, has most of the poetic faculty in him. Wordsworth defines poetry to be, quote, the impassioned expression which is on the face of science, end quote. Science has to do with the construction of things, the casting of the granite ribs of the mighty earth, and all the thousand operations that result in the manifestations on its surface. This is the domain of science. But when there come the grass-bearing meadows, the heaven-reared hills, the great streams that go ever downward, the bubbling fountains that ever arise, the wind that wanders amongst the leaves, and the odors that are wafted upon its wings, when we have color and shape and sound, then we have the material with which poetry has to do. Science has to do with the underwork. For what does this great central world exist, with its hidden winds and waters, its upheavings and its down-sinkings, its strong frame of rock and its heart of fire? What do they all exist for? Not for themselves, surely, but for the sake of this outspreading world of beauty that floats up, as it were, to the surface of the shapeless region of force. Science has to do with the one, and poetry with the other. Poetry is, quote, the impassioned expression that is on the face of science, end quote. To illustrate it still further, you are walking in the woods, and you find the first primrose of the year. You feel almost as if you had found a child. You know in yourself that you have found a new beauty and a new joy, though you have seen it 1,000 times before. It is a primrose, a little flower that looks at me, thinks itself into my heart, and gives me a pleasure distinct in itself, and which I feel as if I could not do without. The impassioned expression on the face of this little outspread flower is its childhood. It means trust, consciousness of protection, faith, and hope. Science, in the person of the botanist, comes after you and pulls it to pieces to see its construction and delights the intellect. But the science itself is dead and kills what it touches. The flower exists not for it, but for the expression on its face, which is its poetry, that expression which you feel to mean a living thing, that expression which makes you feel that this flower is, as it were, just growing out of the heart of God. The intellect itself is but the scaffolding for the uprearing of the spiritual nature. I will make all this yet plainer if you can suppose a human form to be created without a soul in it. Divine science has put it together, but only for the sake of the outshining soul that shall cause it to live and move and have a being of its own in God. When you see the face lighted up with soul, when you recognize it in thought and feeling, joy and love, then you know that here is the end for which it was made. Thus you see the relation that poetry has to science, and you find that, to speak in an apparent paradox, the surface is the deepest after all. For through the surface, for the sake of which all this building went on, we have, as it were, a window into the depths of truth. There is not a form that lives in the world, but is a window cloven through the blank darkness of nothingness, to let us look into the heart and feeling and nature of God. so the surface of things is the best and the deepest, provided it is not mere surface, but the impassioned expression for the sake of which the science of God has thought and labored. Satisfied that this was the nature of poetry, and wanting to convey this to the minds of his fellow men, what vehicle, Wordsworth may be supposed to have asked himself, shall I use? How shall I decide what form of words to employ? Where am I to find the right language for speaking such great things to men? He saw that the poetry of the 18th century, he was born in 1770, was not like nature at all, but was an artificial thing, with no more originality in it than there would be in a picture 100 times copied, the copyists never reverting to the original. You cannot look into this 18th century poetry, excepting, of course, a great proportion of the poetry of Cooper and Thomson, without being struck with a sort of agreement that nothing should be said naturally. A certain set form and mode was employed for saying things that ought never to have been said twice in the same way. Wordsworth resolved to go back to the root of the thing, to the natural simplicity of speech. He would have none of these stereotyped forms of expression. "Where shall I find," said he, "the language that will be simple and powerful?" And he came to the conclusion that the language of the common people was the only language suitable for his purpose. Your experience of the everyday language of the common people may be that it is not poetical. True, but not even a poet can speak poetically in his stupid moments. Wordsworth's idea was to take the language of the common people in their uncommon moods, in their high and consequently simple moods, when their minds are influenced by grief, hope, reverence, worship, love. For then he believed he could get just the language suitable for the poet. As far as that language will go, I think he was right, if I may venture to give an opinion in support of Wordsworth. Of course, there will occur necessities to the poet, which would not be comprehended in the language of a man whose thoughts had never moved in the same directions. But the kind of language will be the right thing, and I have heard such amongst the common people myself, language which they did not know to be poetic, but which fell upon my ear and heart as profoundly poetic both in its feeling and its form. In attempting to carry out this theory, I am not prepared to say that Wordsworth never transgressed his own self-imposed laws, but he adhered to his theory to the last. A friend of the poet's told me that Wordsworth had to him expressed his belief that he would be remembered longest not by his sonnets, as his friend thought, but by his lyrical ballads, those for which he had been reviled and laughed at, the most by critics who could not understand him, and who were unworthy to read what he had written. As a proof of this, let me read to you 3 verses, composing a poem that was especially marked for derision. She dwelt among the untrodden ways, beside the springs of Dove, a maid whom there were none to praise, and very few to love. A violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, fair as a star, when only one is shining in the sky. She lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be. But she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. The last line was especially chosen as the object of ridicule, but I think with most of us the feeling will be that its very simplicity of expression is overflowing in suggestion. It throws us back upon our own experience, for instead of trying to utter what he felt, he says in those simple and common words, You who have known anything of the kind will know what the difference to me is, and only you can know. My intention and desire, he says in one of his essays, are that the interest of the poem shall owe nothing to the circumstances, but that the circumstances shall be made interesting by the thing itself." End quote. In most novels, for instance, the attempt is made to interest us in worthless, commonplace people whom, if we had our choice, we would far rather not meet at all, by surrounding them with peculiar and extraordinary circumstances. But this is a low source of interest. Wordsworth was determined to owe nothing to such an adventitious cause. For illustration, allow me to read that well-known little ballad, The Reverie of Poor Susan, and you will see how entirely it bears out what he lays down as his theory. The scene is in London. At the corner of Wood Street, when daylight appears, hangs a thrush that sings loud. It has sung for 3 years. Poor Susan has passed by the spot, and has heard, in the silence of morning, the song of the bird. 'Tis a note of enchantment. What ails her? She sees a mountain ascending, a vision of trees, bright volumes of vapor through Lothbury glide, and a river flows on through the vale of Cheapside. Green pastures she views in the midst of the dale, down which she so often has tripped with her pail, and a single small cottage, a nest like a dove's, the one only dwelling on earth that she loves. She looks, and her heart is in heaven, but they fade, the mist and the river, the hill and the shade. The stream will not flow, and the hill will not rise, and the colors have all passed away from her eyes. Is any of the interest here owing to the circumstances? Is it not a very common incident? But has he not treated it so that it is not commonplace in the least? We recognize in this girl just the feelings we discover in ourselves, and acknowledge almost with tears her sisterhood to us all. I have tried to make you feel something of what Wordsworth attempts to do, but I have not given you the best of his poems. Allow me to finish by reading the closing portion of the Prelude, the poem that was published after his death. It is addressed to Coleridge. Oh, yet a few short years of useful life, and all will be complete. Thy race be run. Thy monument of glory will be raised. Then, though too weak to head the ways of truth, this age fall back to old idolatry, though man return to servitude as fast as the tide ebbs, to ignominy and shame by nations sink together, we shall still find solace, knowing what we have learned to know, rich in true happiness, if allowed to be faithful alike in forwarding a day of firmer trust, joint labors in the work, should Providence such grace to us vouchsafe, of their deliverance surely yet to come. Prophets of nature, we to them will speak a lasting inspiration, sanctified by reason, blessed by faith. What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how. Instruct them how the mind of man becomes 1,000 times more beautiful than the earth on which he dwells, above this frame of things, which, mid all revolution in the hopes and fears of men, doth still remain unchanged, in beauty exalted, as it is itself of quality and fabric more divine. End of section 13.
Section 14 of A Dish of Orts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dish of Orts
by George MacDonald. Shelley. Whatever opinion may be held with regard to the relative position occupied by Shelley as a poet, it will be granted by most of those who have studied his writings that they are of such an individual and original kind that he can neither be hidden in the shade nor lost in the brightness of any other poet. No idea of his works could be conveyed by instituting a comparison, for he does not sufficiently resemble any other among English writers to make such a comparison possible. Percy Bysshe Shelley was born at Field Place, near Horsham, in the county of Sussex, on the 4th of August, 1792. He was the son of Timothy Shelley, Esquire, and grandson of Sir Bysshe Shelley, the first baronet. His ancestors had long been large landed proprietors in Sussex. As a child, his habits were noticeable. He was especially fond of rambling by moonlight, of inventing wonderful tales, of occupying himself with strange and sometimes dangerous amusements. At the age of 13, he went to Eton. In this little world, that determined opposition to whatever appeared to him an invasion of human rights and liberty, which was afterwards the animating principle of most of his writings, was first roused in the mind of Shelley. Were we not aware of far keener distress which he afterwards endured from yet greater injustice, we might suppose that the sufferings he had to bear from placing himself in opposition to the custom of the school by refusing to fag had made him morbidly sensitive on the point of liberty. At a time, however, when freedom of speech, as indicating freedom of thought, was especially obnoxious to established authorities, when no allowance could be made on the score of youth, still less on that of individual peculiarity, Shelley became a student at Oxford. He was then 18. Devoted to metaphysical speculation, and especially fond of logical discussion, he, in his first year, printed and distributed among the authorities and members of his college a pamphlet, if that can be called a pamphlet, which consisted only of 2 pages, in which he opposed the usual arguments for the existence of a deity, arguments which, perhaps, the most ardent believers have equally considered inconclusive. Whether Shelley wrote this pamphlet as an embodiment of his own opinions, or merely as a logical confutation of certain arguments, the mode of procedure adopted with him was certainly not one which necessarily resulted from the position of those to whose care the education of his opinions was entrusted. Without waiting to be assured that he was the author, and satisfying themselves with his refusal to answer when questioned as to the authorship, they handed him his sentence of expulsion, which had been already drawn up in due form. About this time, Shelley wrote, or commenced writing, Queen Mab, a poem which he never published, although he distributed copies among his friends. In after years, he had such a low opinion of it in every respect that he regretted having printed it at all, and when an edition of it was published without his consent, he applied to the Court of Chancery for an injunction to suppress it. Shelley's opinions in politics and theology, which he appears to have been far more anxious to maintain than was consistent with the peace of the household, were peculiarly obnoxious to his father, a man as different from his son as it is possible to conceive, and his expulsion from Oxford was soon followed by exile from his home. He went to London, where, through his sisters, who were at school in the neighborhood, he made the acquaintance of Harriet Westbrook, whom he eloped with and married when he was 19 and she 16 years of age. It seems doubtful whether the attachment between them was more than the result of the reception accorded by the enthusiasm of the girl to the enthusiasm of the youth, manifesting itself in wild talk about human rights and equally wild plans for their recovery and security. However this may be, the result was unfortunate. They wandered about England, Scotland, and Ireland with frequent and sudden change of residence for rather more than 2 years. During this time, Shelley gained the friendship of some of the most eminent men of the age, of whom the one who exercised the most influence upon his character and future history was William Godwin, whose instructions and expostulations tended to reduce to solidity and form the vague and extravagant opinions and projects of the youthful reformer. Shortly after the commencement of the 3rd year of their married life, an estrangement of feeling, which had been gradually widening between them, resulted in the final separation of the poet and his wife. We are not informed as to the causes of this estrangement, further than that it seems to have been owing in a considerable degree to the influence of an elder sister of Mrs. Shelley, who domineered over her and whose presence became at last absolutely hateful to Shelley. His wife returned to her father's house, where apparently about 3 years after she committed suicide. There seems to have been no immediate connection between this act and any conduct of Shelley. One of his biographers informs us that while they were living happily together, suicide was with Mrs. Shelley a favorite subject of speculation and conversation. Shortly after his first wife's death, Shelley married the daughter of William Godwin. He had lived with her almost from the date of the separation, during which time they had twice visited Switzerland. In the following year, 1817, it was decreed in Chancery that Shelley was not a proper person to take charge of his 2 children by his first wife, who had lived with her till her death. The bill was filed in Chancery by their grandfather, Mr. Westbrook. The effects of this proceeding upon Shelley may be easily imagined. Perhaps he never recovered from them, for they were not of a nature to pass away. During this year he resided at Marlow and wrote The Revolt of Islam, besides portions of other poems, and the next year he left England, not to return. The state of his health, for he had appeared to be in a consumption for some time, and the fear lest his son, by his second wife, should be taken from him, combined to induce him to take refuge in Italy from both impending evils. At Lucca he began his Prometheus and wrote Julian and Medallo. He moved from place to place in Italy, as he had done in his own country. Their 2 children dying, they were for a time left childless, but the loss of these grieved Shelley less than that of his eldest 2, who were taken from him by the hand of man. In 1819, Shelley finished his Prometheus Unbound, writing the greater part at Rome and completing it at Florence. In this year also he wrote his tragedy, The Cenci, which attracted more attention during his lifetime than any other of his works. The Ode to a Skylark was written at Leghorn in the spring of 1820, and in August of the same year, The Witch of Atlas was written near Pisa. In the following year, Shelley and Byron met at Pisa. They were a good deal together, but their friendship although real, does not appear to have been of a very profound nature. For though unlikeness be one of the necessary elements of friendship, there are kinds of unlikeness which will not harmonize. During all this time, he was not only maligned by unknown enemies and abused by anonymous writers, but attempts of other kinds are said to have been made to render his life as uncomfortable as possible. There are grounds, however, for doubting whether Shelley was not subject to a kind of monomania upon this and similar points. In 1821, he wrote his Adonais, a monody on the death of Keats. Part of this poem had its origin in the mistaken notion that the illness and death of Keats were caused by a brutal criticism of his Endymion, which appeared in the Quarterly Review. The last verse of the Adonais seems almost prophetic of his own end. Passionately fond of boating, he and a friend of his, Mr. Williams, united in constructing a boat of a peculiar build, a very fast sailer, but difficult to manage. On the 8th of July, 1822, Shelley and his friend Williams sailed from Leghorn for Lerici, on the Bay of Spezia, near which lay his home for the time. A sudden squall came on, and their boat disappeared. The bodies of the two friends were cast on shore, and according to quarantine regulations, were burned to ashes. Lord Byron, Leigh Hunt, and Mr. Trelawney were present when the body of Shelley was burned, so that his ashes were saved and buried in the Protestant burial ground at Rome, near the grave of Keats, whose body had been laid there in the spring of the preceding year. Cor Cordorium were the words inscribed by his widow on the tomb of the poet. The character of Shelley has been sadly maligned. Whatever faults he may have committed against society, they were not the result of sensuality. One of his biographers, who was his companion at Oxford, and who does not seem inclined to do him more than justice, asserts that while there his conduct was immaculate. The whole picture he gives of the youth makes it easy to believe this. To discuss the moral question involved in one part of his history would be out of place here. But even on the supposition that a man's conduct is altogether inexcusable in individual instances, there is the more need that nothing but the truth should be said concerning that and other portions thereof. And whatever society may have thought itself justified in making subject of reprobation, it must be remembered that Shelley was under less obligation to society than most men. Yet his heart seemed full of love to his kind, and the distress which the oppression of others caused him was the source of much of that wild denunciation which exposed him to the contempt and hatred of those who were rendered uncomfortable by his unsparing and indiscriminate anathemas. In private, he was beloved by all who knew him, a steady, generous, self-denying friend, not only to those who moved in his own circle, but to all who were brought within the reach of any aid he could bestow. To the poor, he was a true and laborious benefactor. That man must have been good to whom the heart of his widow returns with such earnest devotion and thankfulness in the recollection of the past, and such fond hope for the future, as are manifested by Mrs. Shelley in those extracts from her private journal given us by Lady Shelley. As regards his religious opinions, one of the thoughts which most strongly suggests themselves is how ill he must have been instructed in the principles of Christianity. He says himself in a letter to Godwin, quote, I have known no tutor or adviser, not excepting my father, from whose lessons and suggestions I have not recoiled with disgust." End quote. So far is he from being an opponent of Christianity, properly so called, that one can hardly help feeling what a Christian he would have been, could he but have seen Christianity in any other way than through the traditional and practical misrepresentations of it which surrounded him. All his attacks on Christianity are, in reality, directed against evils to which the true doctrines of Christianity are more opposed than those of Shelley could possibly be. How far he was excusable in giving the name of Christianity to what he might have seen to be only a miserable perversion of it is another question, and one which hardly admits of discussion here. It was in the name of Christianity, however, that the worst injuries of which he had to complain were inflicted upon him. Coming out of the cathedral at Pisa one day, Shelley warmly assented to a remark of Leigh Hunt, quote, that a divine religion might be found out if charity were really made the principle of it, instead of faith. Footnote from Shelley Memorials, edited by Lady Shelley, which the writer of this paper has principally followed in regard to the external facts of Shelley's history. Surely the founders of Christianity, even when they magnified faith, intended thereby a spiritual condition of which the central principle is coincident with charity. Shelley's own feelings towards others, as judged from his poetry, seem to be tinctured with the very essence of Christianity. Footnote: his essay on Christianity is full of noble views, some of which are held at the present day by some of the most earnest believers. At what time of his life it was written, we are not informed, but it seems such as would ensure his acceptance with any company of intelligent and devout Unitarians. End footnote. He did not, at one time at least, believe that we could know the source of our being, and seemed to take it as a self-evident truth that the Creator could not be like the creature. But it is unjust to fix upon any utterance of opinion and regard it as the religion of a man who died in his 30th year, and whose habits of thinking were such that his opinions must have been in a state of constant change. Coleridge says in a letter, quote, Shelley's discussions, tending towards atheism of a certain sort, would not have scared me. For me, it would have been a semi-transparent larva, soon to be sloughed, and through which I should have seen the true image, the final metamorphosis. Besides, I have ever thought that sort of atheism the next best religion to Christianity, nor does the better faith I have learned from Paul and John interfere with the cordial reverence I feel for Benedict Spinoza. Shelley's favorite study was metaphysics. The more impulse there is in any direction, the more education and experience are necessary to balance that impulse. One cannot help thinking that Shelley's taste for exercises of this kind was developed more rapidly than the corresponding power. His favorite physical studies were chemistry and electricity. With these he occupied himself from his childhood, apparently, however, with more delight in the experiments themselves than interest in the general conclusions to be arrived at by means of them. In the embodiment of his metaphysical ideas in poetry, the influences of these studies seems to show itself, for he uses forms which appeal more to the outer senses than to the inward eye, and his similes belong to the realm of the fancy rather than the imagination. They lack vital resemblance. Logic had considerable attractions for him. To geometry and mathematics he was quite indifferent. One of his biographers states that, quote, he was neglectful of flowers, end quote, because he had no interest in botany. But one who derived such full delight from the contemplation of their external forms could hardly be expected to feel very strongly the impulse to dissect them. He derived exceeding pleasure from Greek literature, especially from the works of Plato. Several little peculiarities in Shelley's tastes are worth mentioning, because, although in themselves insignificant, they seem to correspond with the nature of his poetry. Perhaps the most prominent of these was his passion for boat sailing. He could not pass any piece of water without launching upon it a number of boats, constructed from what paper he could find in his pockets. The fly leaves of the books he was in the way of carrying with him, for he was constantly reading, often went to this end. He would watch the fate of these boats with the utmost interest till they sank or reached the opposite side. He was just as fond of real boating, and that frequently of a dangerous kind. But it is characteristic of him that all the boats he describes in his poems are of a fairy, fantastic sort, barely related to the boats which battle with earthly winds and waves. Pistol shooting was also a favorite amusement. Fireworks, too, gave him great delight. Some of his habits were likewise peculiar. He was remarkably abstemious, preferring bread and raisins to anything else in the way of eating, and very seldom drinking anything stronger than water. Honey was a favorite luxury with him. While at college, his biographer, Hogg, says he was in the habit, during the evening, of going to sleep on the rug, close to a blazing fire, heat seeming never to have other than a beneficial effect upon him. After sleeping some hours, he would awake perfectly restored, and continue actively occupied till far into the morning. His whole movements are represented as rapid, hurried, and uncertain. He would appear and disappear suddenly and unexpectedly, forget appointments, burst into wild laughter, heedless of his situation whenever anything struck him as peculiarly ludicrous. His changes of residence were most numerous, and frequently made with so much haste that whole little libraries were left behind and often lost. He was very fond of children, and used to make humorous efforts to induce them to disclose to him the still remembered secrets of their pre-existence. He seemed to have a peculiar attraction towards mystery, and was ready to believe in a hidden secret where no one else would have thought of one. His room, while he was at college, was in a state of indescribable confusion. Not only were all sorts of personal necessaries mingled with books and philosophical instruments, but things belonging to one department of service were not unfrequently pressed into the slavery of another. He dressed well, but carelessly. In person, he was tall, slender, and stooping, awkward in gait, but in manners a thorough gentleman. His complexion was delicate, his head, face, and features remarkably small, the last not very regular, but in expression, both intellectual and moral, wonderfully beautiful. His eyes were deep blue, of a wild, strange beauty, his forehead high and white, his hair dark brown, curling, long, and bushy. His appearance in later life is described as singularly combining the appearances of premature age and prolonged youth. The only art in which his taste appears to have been developed was poetry. Even in his poetry, taken as a whole, the artistic element is not generally very manifest. His earliest verses, none of which are included in his collected works, can hardly be said to be good in any sense. He seems in these to have chosen poetry as a fitting material for the embodiment of his ardent, hopeful, indignant thoughts and feelings, but, provided he can say what he wants to say, does not seem to care much about how he says it. Indeed, there is too much of this throughout his works, for if the utterance, instead of the conveyance of thought, were the object pursued in art, of course, not merely imperfection of language, but absolute external unintelligibility would be admissible. But his art constantly increases with his sense of its necessity, so that the sensi, which is the last work of any pretension that he wrote, is decidedly the most artistic of all. There are beautiful passages in Queen Mab, but it is the work of a boy poet, and as it was all but repudiated by himself, it is not necessary to remark further upon it. The Revolt of Islam is a poem of 12 cantos in the Spenserian stanza, but in all respects, except the arrangement of lines and rhymes, his stanza, in common with all other imitations of the Spenserian, has little or nothing of the spirit or individuality of the original. The poem is dedicated to the cause of freedom and records the efforts, successes, defeats, and final triumphant death of two inspired champions of liberty, a youth and maiden. The adventures are marvelous, not intended to be within the bounds of probability, scarcely of possibility. There are very noble sentiments and fine passages throughout the poem. Now and then there is grandeur. But the absence of art is too evident in the fact that the meaning is often obscure, an obscurity not unfrequently occasioned by the difficulty of the stanza, which is the most difficult mode of composition in English, except the rigid sonnet. The words and forms he employs to express thought seem sometimes mechanical devices for that purpose, rather than an utterance which suggested itself naturally to a mind where the thought was vitally present. The words are more a clothing for the thought than an embodiment of it. They do not lie near enough to the thing which is intended to be represented by them. It is, however, but just to remark that some of the obscurity is owing to the fact that even with Mrs. Shelley's superintendence, the works have not yet been satisfactorily edited, or at least not conducted through the press with sufficient care. Footnote: this statement is no longer true. End footnote. The Cenci is a very powerful tragedy, but unfitted for public representation by the horrible nature of the historical facts upon which it is founded. In the execution of it, however, Shelley has kept very much nearer to nature than in any other of his works. He has rigidly adhered to his perception of artistic propriety in respect to the dramatic utterance. It may be doubted whether there is sufficient difference between the modes of speech of the different actors in the tragedy, but it is quite possible to individualize speech far too minutely for probable nature, and in this respect, at least, Shelley has not erred. Perhaps the action of the whole is a little hurried, and a central moment of awful repose and fearful anticipation might add to the force of the tragedy. The scenes also might, perhaps, have been constructed so as to suggest more of evolution, But the central point of horror is most powerfully and delicately handled. You see a possible spiritual horror yet behind, more frightful than all that has gone before. The whole drama, indeed, is constructed around not a prominent point, but a dim, infinitely withdrawn, underground perspective of dismay and agony. Perhaps it detracts a little from our interest in the Lady Beatrice that after all she should wish to live, and should seek to preserve her life by a denial of her crime. She, however, evidently justifies the denial to herself on the ground that the deed being absolutely right, although regarded as most criminal by her judges, the only way to get true justice is to deny the fact, which, there being no guilt, she might consider as only a verbal lie. Her very purity of conscience enables her to utter this with the most absolute innocence of look and word and tone. This is probably a historical fact, and Shelley had to make the best of it. In the drama, there is great tenderness as well as terror, but for a full effect, one feels it is desirable to be brought better acquainted with the individuals than the drama, from its want of graduation, permits. Shelley, however, was only 26 when he wrote it. He must have been attracted to the subject by its embodying the concentration of tyranny, lawlessness, and brutality in the old sensi, as opposed to and exercised upon an ideal loveliness and nobleness in the person of Beatrice. But of all Shelley's works, the Prometheus Unbound is that which combines the greatest amount of individual power and peculiarity. There is an airy grandeur about it, reminding one of the vast masses of cloud scattered about in broken yet magnificently suggestive forms all over the summer sky after a thunderstorm. The fundamental ideas are grand, the superstructure, in many parts, so ethereal that one hardly knows whether he is gazing on towers of solid masonry rendered dim and unsubstantial by intervening vapor, or upon the golden turrets of cloudland, themselves born of the mist which surrounds them with a halo of glory. The beings of Greek mythology are idealized and etherealized by the new souls which he puts into them, making them think his thoughts and say his words. In reading this, as in reading most of his poetry, we feel that, unable to cope with the evils and wrongs of the world as it and they are, he constructs a new universe, wherein he may rule according to his will. And a good will in the main it is, good always in intent, good generally in form and utterance. Of the wrongs which Shelley endured from the collision and resulting conflict between his lawless goodness and the lawful wickedness of those in authority, this is one of the greatest, that during the right period of pupillage, he was driven from the place of learning, cast on his own mental resources long before those resources were sufficient for his support, and irritated against the purest embodiment of good by the harsh treatment he received under its name. If that reverence, which was far from wanting to his nature, had been but presented in the person of some guide to his spiritual being, with an object worthy of its homage and trust, it is probable that the yet free and noble result of Shelley's individuality would have been presented to the world in a form which, while it attracted still only the few, would not have repelled the many, at least not by such things as were merely accidental in their association with his earnest desires and efforts for the well-being of humanity. That which chiefly distinguishes Shelley from other writers is the unequaled exuberance of his fancy. The reader, say for instance of that fantastically brilliant poem, The Witch of Atlas, the work of 3 days, is overwhelmed in a storm, as it were, of rainbow snowflakes and many-colored lightnings, accompanied ever by a low melodious thunder. The evidences of pure imagination in his writings are unfrequent as compared with those of fancy. There are not half the instances of the direct embodiment of idea in form that there are of the presentation of strange resemblances between external things. One of the finest short specimens of Shelley's peculiar mode is his Ode to the West Wind, full of mysterious melody of thought and sound. But of all his poems, the most popular, and deservedly so, is The Skylark. Perhaps the cloud may contest it with the skylark in regard to popular favor, but the cloud, although full of beautiful words and fantastic cloud-like images, is, after all, principally a work of the fancy, while the skylark, though even in its fancy predominates over imagination in the visual images, forms, as a whole, a lovely, true, individual work of art, a lyric not unworthy of the lark, which Mason apostrophizes as sweet feathered lyric. The strain of sadness which pervades it is only enough to make the song of the lark human. In The Sensitive Plant, a poem full of the peculiarities of his genius, tending through a wilderness of fanciful beauties to a thicket of mystical speculation, one curious idiosyncrasy is more prominent than in any other, curious as belonging to the poet of beauty and loveliness. It is the tendency to be fascinated by what is ugly and revolting, so that he cannot withdraw his thoughts from it till he has described it in language, powerful it is true, and poetic, when considered as to its fitness for the desired end, but in force of these very excellences in the means, nearly as revolting as the objects themselves. Associated with this is the tendency to discover strangely unpleasant likenesses between things, which likenesses he is not content with seeing, but seems compelled, perhaps in order to get rid of them himself, to force upon the observation of his reader. But the admirer of Shelley is not pleased to find that 1 or 2 passages of this nature have been omitted in some editions of his works. Few men have been more misunderstood or misrepresented than Shelley. Doubtless this has, in part, been his own fault, as Coleridge implies when he writes to this effect of him, that his horror of hypocrisy made him speak in such a wild way that Southey, who was so much a man of forms and proprieties, was quite misled, not merely in his estimate of his worth, but in his judgment of his character. But setting aside this consideration altogether, and regarding him merely as a poet, Shelley has written verse which will last as long as English literature lasts, valuable not only from its excellence, but from the peculiarity of its excellence. To say nothing of his noble aims and hopes, Shelley will always be admired for his sweet melodies, lovely pictures, and wild prophetic imaginings. His indignant remonstrances, intermingled with grand imprecations, burst in thunder from a heart overcharged with the love of his kind, and roused to a keener sense of all oppression by the wrongs which sought to overwhelm himself. But as he recedes further in time, and men are able to see more truly the proportions of the man, they will judge that without having gained the rank of a great reformer, Shelley had in him that element of wide sympathy and lofty hope for his kind which is essential both to the birth and the subsequent making of the greatest of poets. End of section 14. Read by Carrie Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 16th of October, 2021.
Section 15 of A Dish of Orts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Joanna Michael Hoyt. A Dish of Orts by George MacDonald. A Sermon. Footnote. Read in the Unitarian Chapel, Essex Street, London, 1879. Philippians 3, verses 15 and 16. Let us therefore, as many as be perfect, be thus minded. And if in anything ye be otherwise minded, God shall reveal even this unto you. Nevertheless, whereto we have already attained, let us walk by that same. End quote. This is the reading of the oldest manuscripts. The rest of the verse is pretty clearly a not overwise marginal gloss that has crept into the text. In its origin, opinion is the intellectual body, taken for utterance and presentation by something necessarily larger than any intellect can afford stuff sufficient for the embodiment of. To the man himself, therefore, in whose mind it arose, an opinion will always represent and recall the spirit whose form it is, so long, at least, as the man remains true to his better self. Hence a man's opinion may be for him invaluable, the needle of his moral compass, always pointing to the truth whence it issued, and whose form it is. Nor is the man's opinion of the less value to him that it may change. Nay, to be of true value, it must have in it not only the possibility, but the necessity of change. It must change in every man who is alive, with that life which, in the New Testament, is alone treated as life at all. For if a man's opinion be in no process of change whatever, it must be dead, valueless, hurtful. Opinion is the offspring of that which is itself born to grow, which, being imperfect, must grow or die. Where opinion is growing, its imperfections, however many and serious, will do but little hurt. Where it is not growing, these imperfections will further the decay and corruption which must already have laid hold of the very heart of the man. But it is plain in the world's history that what, at some given stage of the same, was the embodiment in intellectual form of the highest and deepest of which it was then spiritually capable, has often and speedily become the source of the most frightful outrages upon humanity. How is this? Because it has passed from the mind in which it grew into another in which it did not grow, and has of necessity altered its nature. Itself sprung from that which was deepest in the man, it casts seeds which take root only in the intellectual understanding of his neighbor, and these, springing up, produce flowers indeed which look much the same to the eye, but fruit which is poison and bitterness. Worst of it all, the false and arrogant notion that it is duty to force the opinion upon the acceptance of others. But it is because such men themselves hold with so poor a grasp the truth underlying their forms, that they are, in their self-sufficiency, so ambitious of propagating the forms, making of themselves the worst enemies of the truth of which they fancy themselves the champions. How truly, in the case of all genuine teachers of men, shall a man's foes be they of his own household? For of all the destroyers of the truth which any man has preached, none have done it so effectually or so grievously as his own followers. So many of them have received but the forms, and know nothing of the truth which gave him those forms. They lay hold but of the non-essential, the specially perishing in those forms. And these aspects, doubly false and misleading in their crumbling disjunction, they proceed to force upon the attention and reception of men, calling that the truth which is at best but the draggled and useless fringe of its earth-made garment. Opinions so held belong to the theology of hell, not necessarily altogether false in form, but false utterly in heart and spirit. The opinion, then, that is hurtful is not that which is formed in the depths and from the honest necessities of a man's own nature, but that which he has taken up at second hand, the study of which has pleased his intellect, has perhaps subdued fears and mollified distresses which ought rather to have grown and increased until they had driven the man to the true physician, has puffed him up with a sense of superiority as false as foolish, and placed in his hand a club with which to subjugate his neighbor to his spiritual dictation. The true man, even, who aims at the perpetuation of his opinion, is rather obstructing than aiding the course of that truth for the love of which he holds his opinion. For truth is a living thing, opinion is a dead thing, and transmitted opinion a deadening thing. Let us look at St. Paul's feeling in this regard, and, in order that we may deprive it of none of its force, let us note first the nature of the truth which he had just been presenting to his disciples when he follows it with the words of my text. Quote, "But what things were gain to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ, and be found in him, not having mine own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death, if by any means I might attain unto the resurrection of the dead. Not as though I had already attained, either were already perfect, but I follow after, if that I may apprehend that for which also I am apprehended of Christ Jesus. Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus." End quote. St. Paul, then, had been declaring to the Philippians the idea upon which, so far as it lay with him, his life was constructed, the thing for which he lived, to which the whole conscious effort of his being was directed, namely, to be in his very nature one with Christ, to become righteous as he is righteous, to die unto his death, so that he should no more hold the slightest personal relation to evil, but be alive in every fibre to all that is pure, lovely, loving, beautiful, perfect. He had been telling them that he spent himself in continuous effort to lay hold upon that for the sake of which Christ had laid hold on him. This he declares the sole thing worth living for. The hope of this, the hope of becoming one with the living God, is that which keeps a glorious consciousness awake in him, amidst all the unrest of a being not yet at harmony with itself, and a laborious and persecuted life. It cannot therefore be any shadow of indifference to the truth to which he has borne this witness that causes him to add, "If in anything ye be otherwise minded." It is to him even the test of perfection, whether they be thus minded or not. For although a moment before he has declared himself short of the desired perfection, he now says, "Let as many of us as are perfect be thus minded." There is here no room for that unprofitable thing, bare logic. We must look through the shifting rainbow of his words. Rather, we must gather all their tints together, then turn our backs upon the rainbow, that we may see the glorious light which is the soul of it. St. Paul is not that which he would be, which he must be, but he, and all they who with him believe that the perfection of Christ is the sole worthy effort of a man's life, are in the region, though not yet at the center, of perfection. They are even now not indeed grasping, but in the grasp of that perfection. He tells them this is the one thing to mind, the one thing to go on desiring and laboring for, with all the earnestness of a God-born existence. But if anyone be at all otherwise minded, that is, of a different opinion, what then? That it is of little or no consequence? No, verily, but of such endless consequence that God will himself unveil to them the truth of the matter. This is Paul's faith, not his opinion. Faith is that by which a man lives inwardly and orders his way outwardly. Faith is the root, belief the tree, and opinion the foliage that falls and is renewed with the seasons. Opinion is, at best, even the opinion of a true man, but the cloak of his belief, which he may indeed cast to his neighbor, but not with the truth inside it. That remains in his own bosom, the oneness between him and his God. St. Paul knows well, who better, that by no argument, the best that logic itself can afford, can a man be set right with the truth, that the spiritual perception which comes of hungering contact with the living truth, a perception which is in itself a being born again, can alone be the mediator between a man and the truth. He knows that, even if he could pass his opinion over bodily into the understanding of his neighbor, there would be little or nothing gained thereby, for the man's spiritual condition would be just what it was before. God must reveal, or nothing is known. And this, through thousands of difficulties occasioned by the man himself, God is ever and always doing his mighty best to effect. See the grandeur of redeeming liberality in the Apostle. In his heart of hearts he knows that salvation consists in nothing else than being one with Christ, that the only life of every man is hid with Christ in God, and to be found by no search anywhere else. He believes that for this cause was he born into the world, that he should give himself, heart and soul, body and spirit, to him who came into the world that he might bear witness to the truth. He believes that for the sake of this, and nothing less, anything more there cannot be, was the world, with its endless glories, created. Nay, more than all, he believes that for this did the Lord, in whose cross, type and triumph of his self-abnegation, he glories, come into the world, and live and die there. And yet, he says, and says plainly, that a man thinking differently from all this, or at least quite unprepared to make this wholehearted profession of faith, is yet his brother in Christ, in whom the knowledge of Christ that he has will work and work, the new leaven casting out the old leaven, until he too, in the revelation of the Father, shall come to the perfect stature of the fullness of Christ. Meantime Paul, the Apostle, must show due reverence to the halting and dull disciple. He must and will make no demand upon him on the grounds of what he, Paul, believes. He is where he is, and God is his teacher. To his own master, that is, Paul's master and not Paul, he stands. He leaves him to the company of his master. Leaves him? No, that he does not. That he will never do, any more than God will leave him. Still and ever will he hold him and help him. But how help him if he is not to press upon him his own larger and deeper and wiser insights? The answer is ready. He will press, not his opinion, not even the man's opinion, but the man's own faith upon him. Quote, O brother, beloved of the Father, walk in the light, that is, which is thine, not which is mine, in the light which is given to thee, not to me. Thou canst not walk by my light, I cannot walk by thine. How should either walk except by the light which is in him? O brother, what thou seest, that do, and what thou seest not, that thou shalt see. God himself, the Father of lights, will show it to you. End quote. This is the condition of all growth, that, whereto we have attained, we mind that same. For such, following the manuscripts, at least the oldest, seems to me the Apostle's meaning. Obedience is the one condition of progress, and he entreats them to obey. If a man will but work that which is in him, will but make the power of God his own, then it is well with him for evermore. Like his master, Paul urges to action, to the highest operation, therefore to the highest condition of humanity. As Christ was the Son of his Father because he did the will of the Father, so the Apostle would have them the sons of the Father by doing the will of the Father. Whereto ye have attained, walk by that. But there is more involved in this utterance than the words themselves will expressly carry. Next to his love to the Father and the elder brother, the passion of Paul's life, I cannot call it less, is love to all his brothers and sisters. Everything human is dear to him. He can part with none of it. Division, separation, the breaking of the body of Christ is that which he cannot endure. The body of his flesh had once been broken, that a grander body might be prepared for him. Was it for that body itself to tear itself asunder? With the whole energy of his great heart, Paul clung to unity. He could clasp together with might and main the body of his master, the body that master loved because it was a spiritual body, with the life of his Father in it. And he knew well that only by walking in the truth to which they had attained could they ever draw near to each other. Whereto we have attained, let us walk by that. My honored friends, if we are not practical, we are nothing. Now, the one main fault in the Christian Church is separation, repulsion, recoil between the component particles of the Lord's body. I do not care to inquire who is more to blame than another in the evil fact. I only care to insist that it is the duty of every individual man to be innocent of the same. One main cause, perhaps I should say the one cause of this deathly condition, is that whereto we had, we did not. Whereto we have attained, we do not walk by that. Ah, friend, do not now think of thy neighbor. Do not applaud my opinion as just from what thou hast seen around thee, but answer it from thy own being, thy own behavior. Dost thou ever feel thus toward thy neighbor? Yes, of course, every man is my brother, but how can I be a brother to him so long as he thinks me wrong in what I believe, and so long as I think he wrongs in his opinions the dignity of the truth? What, I return, has the man no hand to grasp, no eyes into which yours may gaze far deeper than your vaunted intellect can follow? Is there not, I ask, anything in him to love? Who asks you to be of one opinion? It is the Lord who asks you to be of one heart. Does the Lord love the man? Can the Lord love where there is nothing to love? Are you wiser than he, inasmuch as you perceive impossibility where he has failed to discover it? Or will you say, "Let the Lord love where he pleases, I will love where I please"? Or say, and imagine you yield, "Well, I suppose I must, and therefore I will, but with certain reservations, politely quiet in my own heart"? Or wilt thou say none of all these things, but do them all, one after the other, in the secret chambers of thy proud spirit? If you delight to condemn, you are a wounder, a divider of the oneness of Christ. If you pride yourself on your loftier vision, and are haughty to your neighbor, you are yourself a division, and have reason to ask, "Am I a particle of the body at all?" The Master will deal with thee upon the score. Let it humble thee to know that thy dearest opinion, the one thou dost worship as if it and not God were thy Saviour, this very opinion thou art doomed to change, for it cannot possibly be right, if it work in thee for death and not for life. Friends, you have done me the honor and the kindness to ask me to speak to you. I will speak plainly. I come before you neither hiding anything of my belief, nor foolishly imagining I can transfer my opinions into your bosoms. If there is one role I hate, it is that of the proselytizer. But shall I not come to you as a brother to brethren? Shall I not use the privilege of your invitation, and of the place in which I stand? Nay, must I not myself be obedient to the heavenly vision, in urging you with all the power of my persuasion to set yourselves afresh to walk according to that to which you have attained? So doing, whatever yet there is to learn, you shall learn it. Thus doing, and thus only, can you draw nigh to the center truth. Thus doing, and thus only, shall we draw nigh to each other, and become brothers and sisters in Christ, caring for each other's honor and righteousness and true well-being. It is to them that keep his commandments that he and his Father will come to take up their abode with them. Whether you or I have the larger share of the truth in that which we hold, of this I am sure, that it is to them that keep his commandments that it shall be given to eat of the tree of life. I believe that Jesus is the eternal Son of the eternal Father, that in him the ideal humanity sat enthroned from all eternity, that as he is the divine man, so is he the human God, that there was no taking of our nature upon himself, but the showing of himself as he really was, and that from evermore. These things, friends, I believe, though never would I be guilty of what in me would be the irreverence of opening my mouth in dispute upon them. Not for a moment would I endeavor by argument to convince another of this my opinion. If it be true, it is God's work to show it, for logic cannot. But the more, and not the less, do I believe that he, who is no respecter of persons, will least of all respect the person of him who thinks to please him by respecting his person, calling him Lord, Lord, and not doing the things that he tells him. Even if I be right, friend, and thou wrong, to thee who doest his commandments more faithfully than I, will the more abundant entrance be administered. God grant that, when thou art admitted first, I may not be cast out, but admitted to learn of thee that it is truth in the inward parts that he requireth, and they that have that truth, and they alone, shall ever know wisdom. Bear with me, friends, for I love and honor you. I seek but to stir up your hearts, as I would daily stir up my own, to be true to that which is deepest in us, the voice and the will of the Father of our spirits. Friends, I have not said we are not to utter our opinions. I have only said we are not to make those opinions the point of a fresh start, the foundation of a new building, the groundwork of anything. They are not to occupy us in our dealings with our brethren. Opinion is often the very death of love. Love aright, and you will come to think aright, and those who think aright must think the same. In the meantime it matters nothing. The thing that does matter is that whereto we have attained, by that we should walk. But while we are not to insist upon our opinions, which is only one way of insisting upon ourselves, however we may cloak the fact from ourselves in the vain imagination of thereby spreading the truth, we are bound by loftiest duty to spread the truth, for that is the saving of men. Do you ask, how spread it if we are not to talk about it? Friends, I never said do not talk about the truth, although I insist upon a better and the only indispensable way. Let your light shine. What I said before and say again is, do not talk about the lantern that holds the lamp, but make haste, uncover the light, and let it shine. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works, I incline to the Vatican reading of good things, and glorify your Father who is in heaven. It is not, let your good works shine, but let your light shine. Let it be the genuine love of your hearts taking form in true deeds, not the doing of good deeds to prove that your opinions are right. If ye are thus true, your very talk about the truth will be a good work, a shining of the light that is in you. A true smile is a good work, and may do much to reveal the Father who is in heaven, but the smile that is put on for the sake of looking right, or even for the sake of being right, will hardly reveal him, not being like him. Men say that you are cold. If you fear it may be so, do not think to make yourselves warm by putting on the cloak of this or that fresh opinion. Draw nearer to the central heat, the living humanity of the Son of Man, that ye may have life in yourselves, so heat in yourselves, so light in yourselves. Understand him, obey him. Then your light will shine, and your warmth will warm. There is an infection, as in evil, so in good. The better we are, the more will men glorify God. If we trim our lamps so that we have light in our house, that light will shine through our windows, and give light to those that are not in the house. But remember, love of the light alone can trim the lamp. Had love trimmed Psyche's lamp, it had never dropped the scalding oil that scared him from her. The man who holds his opinion the most honestly ought to see the most plainly that his opinion must change. It is impossible a man should hold anything aright. How shall the created embrace the self-existent Creator? That Creator, and he alone, is the truth. How then shall a man embrace the truth? But to him who will live it, to him, that is, who walks by that to which he has attained, the truth will reach down 1,000 true hands for his to grasp. We would not wish to enclose that which we can do more than enclose, live in, namely, as our home, inherit, exult in, the presence of the infinitely higher and better, the heart of the living one. And if we know that God himself is our inheritance, why should we tremble even with hatred at the suggestion that we may, that we must, change our opinions? If we held them aright, we should know that nothing in them that is good can ever be lost, for that is the true, whatever in them may be the false. It is only as they help us toward God that our opinions are worth a straw, and every necessary change in them must be to more truth, to greater uplifting power. Lord, change me as thou wilt, only do not send me away. That in my opinions for which I really hold them, if I be a true man, will never pass away. That which my evils and imperfections have, in the process of embodying it, associated with the truth must, thank God, perish and fall. My opinions, as my life, as my love, I leave in the hands of him who is my being. I commend my spirit to him of whom it came. Why then that dislike to the very idea of such change, the dread of having to accept the thing offered by those whom we count our opponents, which is such a stumbling block in the way in which we have to walk, such an obstruction to our yet inevitable growth? It may be objected that no man will hold his opinions with the needful earnestness who can entertain the idea of having to change them. But the very objection speaks powerfully against such an overvaluing of opinion. For what is it but to say that, in order to be wise, a man must consent to be a fool? Whatever must be, a man must be able to look in the face. It is because we cleave to our opinions rather than to the living God, because self and pride interest themselves for their own vile sakes with that which belongs only to the truth, that we become such fools of logic and temper that we lie in the prisoned houses of our own fancies, ideas, and experiences, shut the doors and windows against the entrance of the free spirit, and will not inherit the love of the Father. Yet, for the help and comfort of even such a refuser as this, I would say, nothing which you reject can be such as it seems to you. For a thing is either true or untrue. If it be untrue, it looks so far like itself that you reject it, and with it we have nothing more to do. But if it be true, the very fact that you reject it shows that to you it has not appeared true, has not appeared itself. The truth can never be even beheld but by the man who accepts it. The thing, therefore, which you reject is not that which it seems to you, but a thing good and altogether beautiful, altogether fit for your gladsome embrace, a thing from which you would not turn away did you see it as it is, but rush to it, as Dante says, like the wild beast to his den, so eager for the refuge of home. No honest man holds a truth for the sake of that because of which another honest man rejects it. How it may be with the dishonest I have no confidence in my judgment, and hope I am not bound to understand. Let us then, my friends, beware lest our opinions come between us and our God, between us and our neighbor, between us and our better selves. Let us be jealous that the human shall not obscure the divine, for we are not mere human, we too are divine, and there is no such obliterator of the divine as the human that acts undivinely. The one security against our opinions is to walk according to the truth which they contain. And if men seem to us unreasonable, opposers of that which to us is plainly true, let us remember that we are not here to convince men, but to let our light shine. Knowledge is not necessarily light, and it is light, not knowledge, that we have to diffuse. The best thing we can do, infinitely the best, indeed the only thing that men may receive the truth, is to be ourselves true. Beyond all doing of good is the being good. For he that is good not only does good things, but all that he does is good. Above all, let us be humble before the God of truth, faithfully desiring of him that truth in the inward parts which alone can enable us to walk according to that which we have attained. May the God of peace give you his peace. May the love of Christ constrain you. May the gift of the Holy Spirit be yours. Amen. End of section 15.
Section 16 of A Dish of Orts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dish of Orts by George MacDonald. Read by Larry Wilson. True Christian Ministering. Matthew 20:25-28. But Jesus called them unto him, and said, Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it should not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant, even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. How little this is believed! People think, if they think about it at all, that this is very well in the church, but as things go in the world, it won't do. At least their actions imply this, for every man is struggling to get above the other. Every man would make his neighbor his footstool, that he may climb upon him to some throne of glory, which he has in his own mind. There is a continual jostling, and crowding, and buzzing, and striving to get promotion. Of course there are known and noble exceptions, but still there it is. And yet we call ourselves Christians, and we are Christians, all of us, thus far, that the truth is within reach of us all, that it has come nigh to us, talking to us at our door, and even speaking in our hearts. And yet this is the way in which we go on. The Lord said, "It shall not be so among you." Did he mean only his 12 disciples? This was all that he had to say to them. But thanks be to him, he says the same to every one of us now. It shall not be so among you. That is not the way in my kingdom. The people of the world, the people who live in the world, will always think it best to get up, to have less and less of service to do, more and more of service done to them. The notion of rank in the world is like a pyramid. The higher you go up, the fewer are there who have to serve those above them, and who are served more than those underneath them. All who are under serve those who are above, until you come to the apex, and there stands someone who has to do no service, but whom all the others have to serve. Something like that is the notion of position, of social standing and rank. And if it be so, in an intellectual way even, to say nothing of mere bodily service, if any man works to a position that others shall all look up to him, and that he may have to look up to nobody, he has just put himself precisely into the same condition as the people of whom our Lord speaks, as those who exercise dominion and authority, and really he thinks it is a fine thing to be served. But it is not so in the kingdom of heaven. The figure there is entirely reversed. As you may see a pyramid reflected in the water, just so in a reversed way altogether is the thing to be found in the kingdom of God. It is in this way. The Son of Man lies at the inverted apex of the pyramid. He upholds and serves and ministers unto all, and they who would be high in his kingdom must go near to him at the bottom, to uphold and minister to all that they may or can uphold and minister unto. There is no other law of precedence, no other law of rank and position in God's kingdom. And mind, that is the kingdom. The other kingdom passes away. It is a transitory, ephemeral, passing bad thing, and away it must go. It is only there on sufferance, because in the mind of God even that which is bad ministers to that which is good. And when the new kingdom is built, the old kingdom shall pass away. But the man who seeks this rank of which I have spoken must be honest to follow it. It will not do to say, "I want to be great, and therefore I will serve." A man will not get at it so. He may begin so, but he will soon find that that will not do. He must seek it for the truth's sake, for the love of his fellows, for the worship of God, for the delight in what is good. In the kingdom of heaven, people do not think whether I am promoted, or whether you are promoted. They are so absorbed in the delight and glory of the goodness that is round about them, that they learn not to think much about themselves. It is the bad that is in us that makes us think about ourselves. It is necessary for us, because there is bad in us, to think about ourselves. But as we go on, we think less and less about ourselves, until at last we are possessed with the spirit of the truth, the spirit of the kingdom, and live in gladness and in peace. We are prouder of our brothers and sisters than of ourselves. We delight to look at them. God looks at us, and makes us what he pleases, and this is what we must come to. There is no escape from it. But the Lord says that the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto. Was he not ministered unto then? He was ministered unto, as never man was, but he did not come for that. Even now we bring to him the burnt offerings of our very spirits, but he did not come for that. It was to help us that he came. We are told likewise that he is the express image of the Father. Then what he does, the Father must do. And he says himself, when he is accused of breaking the Sabbath by doing work on it, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." Then this must be God's way too, or else it could not have been Jesus' way. It is God's way. Oh, do not think that God made us with his hands, and then turned us out to find out our own way. Do not think of him as being always over our heads, merely thrown over us a widespread benevolence. You can imagine the tenderness of a mother's heart who takes her child even from its beloved nurse to soothe and to minister to it, and that is like God. That is God. His hand is not only over us, but recollect what David said, His hand was upon me. I wish we were all as good Christians as David was. Wherever I go, he said, God is there, beneath me, before me. His hand is upon me. If I go to sleep, He is there. When I go down to the dead, He is there. Everywhere is God. The earth underneath us is His hand upholding us. Footnote: the waters are in the hollow of it. Every spring fountain of gladness about us is His making and His delight. He tends us and cares for us. He is close to us, breathing into our nostrils the breath of life, and breathing into our spirit this thought and that thought to make us look up and recognize the love and care around us. What a poor thing for the little baby would it be if it were to be constantly tended thus tenderly and preciously by its mother, but if it were never to open its eyes to look up and see her mother's face bending over it. A poor thing all its tending would be without that. It is for that that the other exists. It is by that that the other comes, to recognize and know this loving kindness, and to stand up in it strong and glad. This is the ministration of God unto us. Do you ever think, I could worship God if He was so and so? Do you imagine that God is not as good, as perfect, as absolutely all in all as your thoughts can imagine? You cannot come up to it. Do what you will never come up to it. Use all the symbols that we have in nature, in human relations, in family. All are symbols of grace and tenderness and loving kindness between man, and between man and woman, and between woman and woman. But you can never come up to the thought of what God's ministration is. When our Lord came, He just let us see how His Father was doing this always. He came to give His life a ransom for many. It was in giving His life a ransom for us that He died. That was the consummation and crown of it all. But it was His life that He gave for us, His whole being, His whole strength, His whole energy. Not alone His days of trouble and of toil, but deeper than that, He gave us His whole being for us. Yea, He even went down to death for us. But how are we to learn this ministration? I will tell you where it begins. The most of us are forced to work. If you do not see that the commonest things in life belong to the Christian scheme, the plan of God, you have got to learn it. I say this at the beginning. Most of us have to work, and infinitely better is that for us than if we were not forced to work, but not a very fine thing unless it goes to something farther. We are forced to work. And what is our work? It is doing something for other people always. It is ministration in some shape or other. All kind of work is a serving, but it may not be always Christian service. No, some of us only work for our wages. We must have them. We starve and deserve to starve if we do not work to get them. But we must go a little beyond that. Yes, a very great way beyond that. There is no honest work that one man does for another which he may not do as unto the Lord, and not unto men, in which he cannot do right as he ought to do right. Thus I say that the man who sees the commonest thing in the world, recognizing it as part of the divine order of things, the law by which the world goes, being the intention of God that one man should be serviceable and useful to another. The man, I say, who does a thing well because of this, and who tries to do it better, is doing God's service. We talk of divine service. It is a miserable name for a great thing. It is not service, properly speaking, at all. When a boy comes to his father and says, "May I do so and so for you?" or rather comes and breaks out in some way, showing his love to his father, says, "May I come and sit beside you? May I have some of your books? May I come and be quiet a little in your room?" What would you think of that boy if he went and said, "I have been doing my father a service"? So with praying to and thanking God. Do you call that serving God? If it is not serving yourselves, it is worth nothing. If it is not the best condition you can find yourselves in, you have to learn what it is yet. Not so. The work you have to do tomorrow in the counting house, in the shop, or wherever you may be, is that by which you are to serve God. Do it with a high regard, and then there is nothing mean in it. But there is everything mean in it if you are pretending to please people when you only look for your wages. It is mean then. But if you have regard to doing a thing nobly, greatly, and truly, because it is the work that God has given you to do, then you are doing the divine service. Of course, this goes a great deal farther. We have endless opportunities of showing ourselves neighbors to the man who comes near us. That is the divine service. That is the reality of serving God. The others ought to be your reward, if reward is a word that can be used in such a relation at all. Go home and speak to God. Nay, hold your tongue, and quietly go to Him in the secret recesses of your own heart, and know that God is there. Say, God has given me this work to do, and I am doing it. And that is your joy. That is your refuge. That is your going to heaven. It is not service. The words divine service, as they are used, always move me to something of indignation. It is perfect paganism. It is looking to please God by gathering together your services, something that is supposed to be service to Him. He is serving us forever, and our Lord says, "If I have washed your feet, so you ought to wash one another's feet." This will be the way in which to minister for some. But still, when we are beginning to learn this, some of us are looking about us in a blind kind of way, thinking, "I wish I could serve God. I do not know what to do. How is it to be begun? What is at the root of it? What shall I find out to do? Where is there something to do?" Now, first of all, service is obedience, or it is nothing. This is what I would gladly impress upon you, upon every young man who has come to the point to be able to receive it. There is a tendency in us to think that there is something degrading in obedience, something degrading in service. According to the social judgment, there is. According to the judgment of the earth, there is. Not so according to the judgment of heaven, for God would only have us to do the very thing He is doing Himself. You may see the tendency of this nowadays. There is scarcely a young man who will speak of his master. He feels as if there is something that hurts his dignity in doing so. He does just what so many theologians have done about God, who, instead of taking what our Lord has given us, talk about God as the governor of the universe. So a young man talks about his master as the governor. Nay, he even talks of his own father in that way. And then you come to another religion altogether, and a worse one. I take these things as symptoms, mind. I know habits may be picked up, when they get common, without any great corresponding feeling. But a wrong habit tends always to be a wrong feeling, and if a man cannot learn to honor his father so as to be able to call him father, I think one or the other of them is greatly to blame. Whether the father or the son, I cannot say. I know there are such parents that tell their children that God is their father, is no help to them, but the contrary. I heard of a lady just the other day, to whom, in trying to comfort her, someone said, "Remember, God is your father." "Do not mention the name Father to me," she said. Ah, that kind of fault does not lie in God, but in those who, not being like Him, cannot use the names aright which belong to Him. But now as to this service, this obedience. Our Lord came to give His life a ransom for the many, and to minister unto all in obedience to His Father's will. We call Him equal with God. At least most of us here, I suppose, do. Of course we do not pretend to explain. We know that God is greater than He, because He said so. But somehow we can worship Him with our God, and we need not try to distinguish more than is necessary about it. But do you think that He was less divine than the Father when He was obedient? Observe His obedience to the will of His Father. He was not the ruler there. He did not give the commands. He obeyed them. And yet we say he is God. Ah, that is no difficulty to me. Obedience is as divine in its essence as command. Nay, it may be more divine in the human being far. It cannot be more divine in God, but obedience is far more divine in its essence with regard to humanity than command is. It is not the ruling being who is most like God. It is the man who ministers to his fellow who is like God, and the man who will just sternly and rigidly do what his master tells him, be that master what he may, who is likest Christ in that one particular matter. Obedience is the grandest thing in the world to begin with. Yes, and we shall end with it too. I do not think the time will ever come when we shall not have something to do, because we are told to do it without knowing why. Those parents act most foolishly who wish to explain everything to their children. Most foolishly. No, teach your child to obey, and you give him the most precious lesson that can be given to a child. Let him come to that before you have had him long to do what he is told, and you have given him the plainest, first, and best lesson that you can give him. If he never goes to school at all, he had better have that lesson than all the schooling in the world. Hence, when some people are accustomed to glorify this age of ours as being so much better in everything than those which went before, I look back to the times of chivalry, which we regard now almost as a thing to laugh at, or a merry thing to make jokes about. But I find that one essential of chivalry was obedience. It is recognized in our army still, but in those times it was carried much farther. When a boy was 7 years old, he was sent into another family and put with another boy, there to do what? To wait with him upon the master and the mistress of the house, and to be taught as well what few things they knew in those times in the way of intellectual cultivation. But he also learned stern, strict obedience, such as it was impossible for him to forget. Then, when he had been there 7 years, hard at work, standing behind the chair and ministering, he was advanced a step. And what was that step? He was made an esquire. He had his armor given him. He had to watch his armor in the chapel all night, laying it on the altar in silent devotion to God. I do not say that all these things were carried out afterwards, but this was the idea of them. He was an esquire. And what was the duty of an esquire? More service. More important service. He still had to attend to his master, the knight. He had to watch him. He had to groom his horse for him. He had to see that his horse was sound. He had to clean his armor for him, to see that every bolt, every rivet, every strap, every buckle was sound, for the life of his master was in his hands. The master, having to fight, must not be troubled with these things, and therefore the squire had to attend to them. Then 7 years after that, a more solemn ceremony is gone through, and the squire is made a knight. But is he free of service then? No, he makes a solemn oath to help everybody who needs help, especially women and children, and so he rides out into the world to do the work of a true man. There was a grand and essential idea of Christianity in that, no doubt wonderfully broken and shattered, but not more so than the Christian church has been. Wonderfully broken and shattered, but still the essence of obedience. And I say it is recognized in our army still, and in every army, and where it is lost, it is a terrible loss, and an army is worth nothing without it. You remember that terrible story from the East, that fearful death charge, one of the grandest things in our history, although one of the most blundering. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die, into the valley of death rode the 600. So with the Christian man. Whatever meets him, obedience is the thing. If he is told by his conscience, which is the candle of God within him, that he must do a thing, why he must do it. He may tremble from head to foot at having to do it, but he will tremble more if he turns back. You recollect how our old poet Spenser shows us the Knight of the Red Cross, who is the knight of holiness, ill in body, diseased in mind, without any of his armor on, attacked by a fearful giant. What does he do? Run away? No, he has but time to catch up his sword, and trembling in every limb, he goes on to meet the giant. And that is the thing that every Christian man must do. I cannot put it too strongly. It is impossible. There is no escape from it. If death itself lies before us, and we know it, there is nothing to be said. It is all to be done, and then there is no loss. Everything else is all lost unto God. Look at our Lord. He gave his life to do the will of the Father, and on he went and did it. Do you think it was easy for him? Easier for him than it would have been for us? Ah, the greater the man, the more delicate and tender his nature, and the more he shrinks from the opposition even of his fellow men, because he loves them. It was a terrible thing for Christ. Even now and then, even in the little touches that come to us in the scanty story, though enough, this breaks out. We are told by John that at the Last Supper he was troubled in spirit and testified. And then how he tries to comfort himself as soon as Judas has gone out to do the thing which was to finish his great work. Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God be glorified in him, God shall also glorify him in himself. Then he adds, just gathering up his strength, I shall straightway glorify him. This was said to his disciples, but I seem to see in it that some of it was said for himself. This is the grand obedience. Oh, friends, this is a hard lesson to learn. We find every day that it is a hard thing to teach. We are continually grumbling because we cannot get the people about us, our servants, our tradespeople, or whoever they may be, to do just what we tell them. It makes half the misery in the world because they will have something of their own in it against what they are told. But are we not always doing the same thing? And ought we not to learn something of forgiveness for them, and very much from the fact that we are just in the same position? We only recognize in part that we are put here in this world precisely to learn to be obedient. He who is our Lord and our God went on being obedient all the time, and was obedient always. And I say it is as divine for us to obey as it is for God to rule. As I have said already, God is ministering the whole time. Now do you want to know how to minister? Begin by obeying. Obey everyone who has a right to command you. But above all, look to what our Lord has said, and find out what he wants you to do out of what he left behind. And try whether obedience to that will not give a consciousness of use, of ministering, of being a part of the grand scheme and way of God in this world. In fact, take your place in it as a vital portion of the divine kingdom, or to use a better figure than that, a vital portion of the Godhead. Try it and see whether obedience is not salvation, whether service is not dignity, whether you will not feel in yourselves that you have begun to be cleansed from your plague when you begin to say, I will seek no more to be above my fellows, but I will seek to minister to them, doing my work in God's name for them. Who sweeps the room as for thy law, makes that and the action fine. Both the room and the action are good when done for God's sake. That is dear old George Herbert's way of saying the same truth, for every man has his own way of saying it. The gift of the Spirit of God to make you think as God thinks, feel as God feels, judge as God judges, is just the one thing that is promised. I do not know anything else that is promised positively but that. And who dares pray for anything else with perfect confidence? God will not give us what we pray for, except it be good for us. But that is one thing that we must have or perish. Therefore let us pray for that, and with the name of God dwelling in us. If this is not true, the whole world is a heap of ruins. Let us go forth and do this service of God in ministering to our fellows, and so helping him in his work of upholding and glorifying and saving all. End of section 16.
Section 17 of A Dish of Orts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dish of Orts by George MacDonald. The Fantastic Imagination. That we have in English no word corresponding to the German Märchen drives us to use the word fairy tale, regardless of the fact that the tale may have nothing to do with any sort of fairy. The old use of the word fairy, by Spenser at least, might however well be adduced, were justification or excuse necessary, where need must. Were I asked what is a fairy tale, I should reply, read Undine, that is a fairy tale. Then read this and that as well, and you will see what is a fairy tale. Were I further begged to describe the fairy tale or define what it is, I would make answer that I should as soon think of describing the abstract human face, or stating what must go to constitute a human being. A fairy tale is just a fairy tale, as a face is just a face, and of all fairy tales I know, I think Undine the most beautiful. Many a man, however, who would not attempt to define a man, might venture to say something as to what a man ought to be. Even so much I will not in this place venture with regard to the fairy tale, for my long past work in that kind might but poorly instance or illustrate my now more matured judgment. I will but say some things helpful to the reading in right-minded fashion of such fairy tales as I would wish to write or care to read. Some thinkers would feel sorely hampered if at liberty to use no forms but such as existed in nature, or to invent nothing save in accord with the laws of the world of the senses, but it must not therefore be imagined that they desire escape from the region of law. Nothing lawless can show the least reason why it should exist, or could at best have more than an appearance of life. The natural world has its laws, and no man must interfere with them in the way of presentment any more than in the way of use. But they themselves may suggest laws of other kinds, and man may, if he pleases, invent a little world of his own, with its own laws, for there is that in him which delights in calling up new forms, which is the nearest perhaps he can come to creation. When such forms are new embodiments of old truths, we call them products of the imagination. When they are mere inventions, however lovely, I should call them the work of the fancy. In either case, law has been diligently at work. His world, once invented, the highest law that comes next into play is that there shall be harmony between the laws by which the new world has begun to exist. And in the process of his creation, the inventor must hold by those laws. The moment he forgets one of them, he makes the story by its own postulates incredible. To be able to live a moment in an imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken, we fall out of it. The imagination in us, whose exercise is essential to the most temporary submission to the imagination of another, immediately with the disappearance of law, ceases to act. Suppose the gracious creatures of some childlike region of fairyland talking either Cockney or Gascon. Would not the tale, however lovelily begun, sink at once to the level of the burlesque, of all forms of literature the least worthy? A man's inventions may be stupid or clever, but if he do not hold by the laws of them, or if he make one law jar with another, he contradicts himself as an inventor. He is no artist. He does not rightly consort his instruments, or he tunes them in different keys. The mind of man is the product of live law. It thinks by law, it dwells in the midst of law, it gathers from law its growth. With law, therefore, can it alone work to any result. Inharmonious, unconsorting ideas will come to a man, but if he try to use one of such, his work will grow dull, and he will drop it from mere lack of interest. Law is the soil in which alone beauty will grow. Beauty is the only stuff in which truth can be clothed. And you may, if you will, call imagination the tailor that cuts her garments to fit her, and fancy his journeyman that puts the pieces of them together, or perhaps at most embroiders their buttonholes. Obeying law, the maker works like his creator. Not obeying law, he is such a fool as heaps a pile of stones and calls it a church. In the moral world it is different. There a man may clothe in new forms and for his employ his imagination freely, but he must invent nothing. He may not for any purpose turn its laws upside down. He must not meddle with the relations of live souls. The laws of the spirit of man must hold alike in this world and in any world he may invent. It were no offense to suppose a world in which everything repelled instead of attracted the things around it. It would be wicked to write a tale representing a man it called good as always doing bad things, or a man it called bad as always doing good things. The notion itself is absolutely lawless. In physical things a man may invent, in moral things he must obey, and take their laws with him into his invented world as well. Quote, "You write as if a fairy tale were a thing of importance. Must it have meaning?" Unquote. It cannot help having some meaning. If it have proportion and harmony, it has vitality, and vitality is truth. The beauty may be plainer in it than the truth, but without the truth the beauty could not be, and the fairy tale would give no delight. Everyone, however, who feels the story will read its meaning after his own nature and development. One man will read one meaning in it, another will read another. Quote, "If so, how am I to assure myself that I'm not reading my own meaning into it, but yours out of it?" End quote. Why should you be so assured? It may be better that you should read your meaning into it. That may be a higher operation of your intellect than the mere reading of mine out of it. Your meaning may be superior to mine. Quote, "Suppose my child ask me what the fairy tale means. What am I to say?" End quote. If you do not know what it means, what is easier than to say so? If you do see a meaning in it, there it is for you to give him. A genuine work of art must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean. If my drawing, on the other hand, is so far from being a work of art that it needs "This is a horse" written under it, what can it matter that neither you nor your child should know what it means? It is there not so much to convey a meaning as to wake a meaning. If it do not even wake an interest, throw it aside. A meaning may be there, but it is not for you. If, again, you do not know a horse when you see it, the name written under it will not serve you much. At all events, the business of the painter is not to teach zoology. But indeed your children are not likely to trouble you about the meaning. They find what they're capable of finding, and more would be too much. For my part, I do not write for children, but for the childlike, whether of 5 or 50 or 75. A fairy tale is not an allegory. There may be allegory in it, but it is not an allegory. He must be an artist indeed, who can in any mode produce a strict allegory that is not a weariness to the spirit. An allegory must be mastery or mordage. A fairy tale, like a butterfly or a bee, helps itself on all sides, sips at every wholesome flower, and spoils not one. The true fairy tale is, to my mind, very like the sonata. We all know that a sonata means something, and where there is the faculty of talking with suitable vagueness and choosing metaphor sufficiently loose, mind may approach mind in the interpretation of a sonata, with the result of a more or less contenting consciousness of sympathy. But if 2 or 3 men sat down to write each what the sonata meant to him, what approximation to definite idea would be the result? Little enough, and that little more than needful. We should find it had roused related, if not identical feelings, but probably not one common thought. Has the sonata therefore failed? Had it undertaken to convey, or ought it to be expected to impart anything defined, anything notionally recognizable? Quote, "But words are not music. Words at least are meant and fitted to carry a precise meaning." End quote. It is very seldom indeed that they carry the exact meaning of any user of them, and if they can be so used as to convey definite meaning, it does not follow that they ought never to carry anything else. Words are live things that may be variously employed to various ends. They can convey a scientific fact, or throw a shadow of her child's dream on the heart of a mother. They are things to put together like the pieces of a dissected map, or to arrange like the notes on a stave. Is the music in them to go for nothing? It can hardly help the definiteness of a meaning. Is it therefore to be disregarded? They have length and breadth and outline. Have they nothing to do with depth? Have they only to describe, never to impress? Has nothing any claim to their use but the definite? The cause of a child's tears may be altogether undefinable. Has the mother therefore no antidote for his vague misery? That may be strong in color which has no evident outline. A fairy tale, a sonata, a gathering storm, a limitless night, seizes you and sweeps you away. Do you begin at once to wrestle with it and ask whence its power over you, whither it is carrying you? The law of each is in the mind of its composer. That law makes one man feel it this way, another man feel that way. To one the sonata is a world of odor and beauty, to another of soothing only and sweetness. To one the cloudy rendezvous is a wild dance, with a terror at its heart. To another a majestic march of heavenly hosts, with truth in their center pointing their course, but as yet restraining her voice. The greatest forces lie in the region of the uncomprehended. I will go farther. The best thing you can do for your fellow, next to rousing his conscience, is not to give him things to think about, but to wake things up that are in him, or say, to make him think things for himself. The best nature does for us is to work in us such moods in which thoughts of high import arise. Does any aspect of nature wake but one thought? Does she ever suggest only one definite thing? Does she make any two men in the same place at the same moment think the same thing? Is she therefore a failure because she's not definite? Is it nothing that she rouses the something deeper than the understanding, the power that underlies thoughts? Does she not set feeling and so thinking at work? Would it be better that she did this after one fashion and not after many fashions? Nature is mood-engendering, thought-provoking. Such ought the sonata, such ought the fairy tale to be. Quote, but a man may then imagine in your work what he pleases, what you never meant. End quote. Not what he pleases, but what he can. If he be not a true man, he will draw evil out of the best. We need not mind how he treats any work of art. If he be a true man, he will imagine true things. What matter whether I meant them or not? They are there, none the less that I cannot claim putting them there. One difference between God's work and man's is that while God's work cannot mean more than he meant, man's must mean more than he meant. For in everything that God has made, there's layer upon layer of ascending significance. Also, he expresses the same thought in higher and higher kinds of that thought. It is God's things, his embodied thoughts, which alone a man has to use, modified and adapted to his own purposes, for the expression of his thoughts. Therefore he cannot help his words and figures falling into such combinations in the mind of another as he had himself not foreseen. So many are the thoughts allied to every other thought, so many are the relations involved in every figure, so many the facts hinted in every symbol. A man may well discover truth in what he wrote, for he was dealing all the time with things that came from thoughts beyond his own. Quote, but surely you would explain your idea to one who asked you? End quote. I say again, if I cannot draw a horse, I will not write, this is a horse, under what I foolishly meant for one. Any key to a work of imagination would be nearly, if not quite, as absurd. The tale is there not to hide, but to show. If it show nothing at your window, do not open your door to it. Leave it out in the cold. To ask me to explain is to say, roses, boil 'em or we won't have 'em. My tales may not be roses, but I will not boil them. So long as I think my dog can bark, I will not sit up to bark for him. If a writer's aim be logical conviction, he must spare no logical pains, not merely to be understood, but to escape being misunderstood. Where his object is to move by suggestion, to cause to imagine, then let him assail the soul of his reader as the wind assails an aeolian harp. If there be music in my reader, I would gladly wake it. Let fairy tale of mine go for a firefly that now flashes, now is dark, but may flash again. Caught in a hand which does not love its kind, it will turn to an insignificant, ugly thing that can neither flash nor fly. The best way with music, I imagine, is not to bring the forces of our intellect to bear upon it, but to be still and let it work on that part of us for whose sake it exists. We spoil countless precious things by intellectual greed. He who will be a man and will not be a child must, he cannot help himself, become a little man, that is, a dwarf. He will, however, need no consolation, for he is sure to think himself a very large creature indeed. If any strain of my broken music make a child's eyes flash, or his mother's grow for a moment dim, my labor will not have been in vain. End of section 17, read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2021. End of A Dish of Orts by George MacDonald.